both the MACo and local governments on our website when it gets rendered and sent back to us. So usually by the end of the day or on Monday. So great. We're so glad all of you have been able to join us. We appreciate your time. This has been a biweekly town hall session that we've been having, just an opportunity for commissioners and other county folks from across the state to convene, chance to share questions if you might have them, and allow MACo an opportunity to share some of the latest news that is coming out that might affect counties. So with that brief introduction, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the MACo staff of Eric, Jason, and Chantel to share with you all the changes or the opportunities to apply for the COVID-19 funding through the CARES Act, something like that. So I'm sure they'll correct me. So go ahead, Eric and Jason and Chantel.
Thanks, Dan. I too want to say thank you to Local Government Center and Dan and Ashley for facilitating these meetings. They've been, I think, pretty helpful. We had planned to do an update of the 2 meetings that we've had with the governor's budget office on the CARES Act reimbursement formula and distribution, dates of distribution, and eligible expenses. And then this morning, we were made aware of the new guidance that was issued by Treasury sometime yesterday that helped clarify what the expectation was on both the use and distribution of CARES Act funding. So for a little history, you guys all remember 1.25 billion with a B was the minimum distribution to states. Montana, being a low population state, received that minimum distribution of 1.25 billion for what the governor's office has affectionately referred to as the governor's coronavirus relief fund. At the time that we've had the 2 meetings, including on Wednesday of this week, it was our understanding that the governor had full discretion on what the use of those funds would look like. So we were negotiating with them about what allowable costs would be. You have seen the survey that we sent out Wednesday or Thursday requesting information about your first responder, public safety, and public health incurred costs personnel-wise from the date of the governor's declaration, which was March 12th, up to the end of the phase 1 reopening. We asked for that because in our negotiations with the governor's office and then guidance with Treasury, it seemed apparent that Treasury was instructing or at least making allowable, in fact, presumptively allowable, those first responder costs if staff were significantly dedicated to COVID-19 response costs. So, we made a good faith argument that your law enforcement, definitely your public health, and your first responder folks out there in the counties were primarily dealing with COVID-19 response from the time of the declared disaster up to the end of phase 1. As of yesterday, and we will send this out, Treasury clarified both guidance and expectations, and I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the new document, again, that was just issued yesterday. And it's in the form of a question and answer, a frequently asked questions document. The question was posed, should states receiving payment transfer funds to local governments that did not receive payments directly from Treasury? For history, populations greater than 500,000 under CARES Act were given direct allocations from Treasury. So this question is, if you didn't receive a direct allocation and you're a local government, should states be distributing funds to local governments? I'm going to read verbatim the answer. Yes. Provided that the transferred funds are used by the local government for eligible expenditures under the statute. To facilitate prompt distribution of the Title V funds, the CARES Act authorized Treasury to make direct payments to local governments with populations in excess of 500,000, an amount equal to 45% of the local government's per capita share of the statewide allocation. This statutory structure was based on a recognition that it is more administratively feasible to rely on states rather than the federal government to manage the transfer of funds to smaller local governments. Consistent with the need of all local governments for funding to address the public health emergency, states should transfer to local governments with populations of 500,000 or less using as a benchmark the per capita allocation formula that governs payments to larger local governments. This approach will ensure equitable treatment among local governments of all sizes. For example, a state received the minimum 1.25 billion allocation and had one county with a population over 500,000 that received 250 million directly. The state should distribute 45% of the 1 billion it received, or 450 million, to local governments within the state, with a population of 500,000 or yes. Treasury, as of yesterday, has clarified its expectations. 45% of the CARES Act funds received by the state of Montana should go to local governments. In all of our previous negotiations, we were asking for a slice of the pie, and it appears that that has flipped entirely on its head as of yesterday. We are entitled to 45% of the CARES Act funds. Another question that was posed said, may states impose restrictions on transfer of funds to local governments? And I'll read you the answer. Yes, to the extent that the restrictions facilitate the state's compliance with the requirements set forth in Section 601D of the Social Security Act, outlined in the guidance and other applicable requirements to such things as the Single Audit Act discussed below. Other restrictions are not permissible. What the Treasury is saying to the state is that they can't create additional obstacles or hurdles or ineligible expenses, that the 45%, according to the CARES guidelines, should be distributed to local governments with the guidance that Treasury has issued. The state can and should not impose additional restrictions on the distribution of those funds. And then finally, one of the areas that we've been struggling with most is the state's, I think, legitimate request that local governments exhaust all remedies for additional reimbursement before coming to the CARES Act for funding. The logic was, I think, good in principle, but difficult in practice. For example, your emergency operations centers likely are going to be eligible for some portion of reimbursement through FEMA. The state was positioning themselves to say that your FEMA applications would have to at least be concurrent, if not before your CARES Act application, so you could exhaust all additional outside sources of revenue before you came to CARES for reimbursement of those incurred costs. The question was posed to Treasury, are recipients required to use other federal funds or seek reimbursements under other federal programs before using fund payments to satisfy eligible expenses? The answer, no. Recipients may use fund payments for any expense eligible under the Social Security Act outlined in the guidance. Fund payments are not required to be used as a source of funding of last resort. However, as noted below, recipients may not use payments from the fund to cover expenditures for which they will receive additional reimbursement. Now, I have no idea how the governor's office is going to respond to this. I tried to get a hold of the budget director just in advance of this conversation so we can get some clarity. Well, before we were negotiating with them about how a distribution would look like and what might be eligible expenses, I don't think we're in that same position anymore. If Treasury is indicating to states that 45% should come to the locals and that the state cannot impose additional restrictions on the use of those funds. So I'm asking you to follow through with the survey that we sent out. I want to get an estimate of what those first responder, public safety, public health, sheriff's department, detention officer costs are during the timeframes that we requested, but I don't think that it's going to be limited to the declared disaster and to June 1st, at least not according to the Treasury guidance. So follow through with your requests, the request and the email and the survey that we sent out, but there's going to be plenty more to come once we get a better handle on how the state's going to respond to the new guidance that's issued by Treasury. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
We have a call-in user who has had a hand up. It's call-in user 5. It looks 06400. You are unmuted now if you'd like to share your thoughts. All right, I'm not getting any response, so we will go to another one. We have a hand up from George. George, you are unmuted if you want to go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So, do we have a timeline of when the 45% of the 1.25 billion will be distributed to counties? Got some stuff from MACo that those distributions can be made really quickly from the states to local governments. So any idea when that can occur?
Commissioner, great question. Up until yesterday, we were working on a reimbursement formula that allowed for 3 opportunities for requests for distribution of incurred costs. In our meeting on Wednesday, based on the timing, the governor's office wanted to make available as fast as possible the first opportunity for counties to request reimbursement. So they set an early June deadline for you to, if you've had those costs incurred and could prove costs incurred, submit for reimbursement in June. And then they had 2 more, so they could get through a 3-phase distribution process up to and including the first month of December, where you would estimate costs through the end of the year. I think that's likely going to change given the new Treasury guidance, because what the state was doing is creating a system where they would hold the money, have you prove use of that, prove expenditures, and then ask for reimbursement. And I think, although there's still going to be some compliance aspect of it, I think it's changed entirely with the new guidance that was delivered. Now, that being said, I still think there's going to be a process that looks like you submitting for money and them distributing the money. And the state is ultimately on the hook for proving that the use of those funds were under the CARES Act and Treasury guidance. So they are the responsible entity in terms of Inspector General audits after all this CARES Act funding is distributed. But I can't answer your direct question about when they'll start making those distributions, other than they're still going to require a process where you prove you're going to use it for eligible expenses.
Thank you, Eric.
We have another hand up, Jay Strauss. You are now unmuted.
Eric, is there a definitive resource available for us to look at in regards to defining those eligible expenses? And then secondly, is there going to be a time frame if funds are not expended on eligible expenses that it would have to be returned to the state, or does it stay with the counties?
Commissioner, great question. The best information we have in terms of a template of allowable expenses, or now I call it the 4th iteration of Treasury guidance. So I'll send that out. I think you as an executive committee member received that this morning, but we haven't distributed it widely to the membership, which we'll do today. Treasury guidance continues to change, so it's further clarified, but I don't expect a retraction from what they put out yesterday. There's a presumption that your law enforcement and first responder and public health costs, there's a presumption by Treasury that those costs incurred are entirely reimbursable for CARES Act. So I'm going to tell the governor's office that we expect, and a county can ask for, the full costs, benefits included, of your law enforcement, detention, public health costs entirely. The Treasury guidance is still a little ambiguous about how a county could capture additional money and put it into things like economic development or direct assistance to people that were impacted economically. I think that will continue to be fleshed out, but it still needs to be. I believe the state will want to, and will want to have a part of that, MACo proper, will want to have a part in defining what legitimate eligible costs are and make it as uniform as we can across local governments. And we weren't I think it's fair to say we weren't in a position to do that under the old framework, where it was the governor's money that he was sharing with us. I think we're in a much better position now that it's our money that the state is holding to be able to define what those allowable costs are. So definitely more information to come on that, but we're in a much better position today than we have been at any time during this CARES Act conversation.
All right, any other does that include the SRS as reimbursable?
As in secure rural schools or sheriff's office retirement?
We'll see if the text, sheriff.
I would say, given the current Treasury guidance, they may have a point to say your personnel cost and benefit cost. So what your total outlay is for a sheriff's deputy is entirely reimbursable, including your pension costs. And I'll say that's applicable for SRS in addition to PERS for your public health folks. Full costs of employment.
Great. Dolores Plumage, you have your hand raised and you are now unmuted if you'd like to speak.
Yes, Eric, when you say the state, which department do we send this request to? Is it the Treasury, or which department do we submit the request?
The current framework that the governor's office is operating under is giving the discretion and the processing authority to Department of Administration, Local Government Services Bureau. The Bureau Chief of Local Government Services Bureau and Department of Admin has been the one that's been helping create the sheets. I don't expect that to change, so it's still going to be State Department of Administration that's going to process the reimbursement requests. They don't have the framework entirely developed yet. They don't have the time frame developed yet, and they don't have the allowable expenses refined yet. That's the work that we're still doing sort of behind the scenes. But I anticipate it will be Department of Administration through a similar to a web grants application process that you folks are used to with Barca, but a different vendor created an entire different software system to upload, make your submissions, have them reviewed by D of A, and get the checks back to the counties.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question from Jerry Collins. You are unmuted.
Eric, I got a question. You guys were first appointed to that board. One of the things that came over the news was they were going to expand trails and stuff like that for bikes and hiking. The way I understood the rules of the CARES Act was you have to spend your budgets first, especially local government like we are. So our department heads are documenting everything that's over and above what we could normally use as business operations. How, I guess I asked you that question once before this text, but how are we just going to come and make sure that we aren't in where we could have maybe made more or used more CARES money and make sure that we're not going to be audited and have to send a bunch of money back. I'm just curious because our department heads, you know, our little county are doing the best they can, but I'd hate to get nailed for double dipping or whatever you want to call it. Just a thought.
Mr. Collins, the Treasury guidance has been really clear and succinct that the ultimate responsible entity for use of the funds is the first receiver of the funds. So the state of Montana, when there are audits, is going to be on the hook for any inappropriate use of those funds. That leads me to believe that the state of Montana is going to be pretty prescriptive about what they'll allow for allowable uses, because if you misuse your funds, there's no hook for an inspector general or the U.S. Treasury to come back and get money from the counties. They can only get it from the state. That being said, what will ultimately end up happening, you were correct that at first Treasury guidance said that you can only use the money for unbudgeted COVID-19 response costs, but you clearly can use the money for budgeted personnel in law enforcement, first responder, and public health. So that unbudgeted COVID-19 response cost category fits for everything other than your personnel costs. And what it'll ultimately do, if you get reimbursed for all of your public health and public safety costs, it will free up general fund money or levied money that we're going to those purposes for other purposes that you can use. And there's no hook or trace back to how you are going to be able to use this money after it comes into the general fund, and then you use it, prioritize it how you want. There will be audits because you're going to be required to comply with the Single Audit Act in the receipt of the federal funds. So your use of those funds will be audited on your own financials in following fiscal years, but the hook back to Treasury only applies to the state of Montana.
Follow up, I guess, Eric, because we applied for the PPP payroll protection for the health center downstairs, and so we've got that, but then there again, we've had a lot of overtime and everything, so I guess I'm just worried about being double dip, claiming I'm double dipping or we're double dipping using PPP plus if we go to the state for some more money. Just confusing.
That's a concern, Commissioner, and I'll say for all of you that are on the call that have hospital districts, hospitals that you work with or that you're partners with, staff that are working in those hospitals, nursing homes in particular, because those facilities were given different allocations in the CARES Act and direct funding for everything from increased wages for some of the direct care workers to cash payments based on number of beds or Medicaid utilization. Be really careful about what you're going to claim for reimbursement if it does look like double dipping. We'll have to sort of look at those on an individual basis, and Jason's already volunteered to help in any way he can to get creative in helping you make a request that will pass all audit muster and get you the money from the state without double dipping.
I like the smile on his face.
He did offer, really.
I did.
Okay, thanks.
Just to clarify on a couple of things, Commissioner Struff, you asked about returning money to the state. The way I envision it is we will be asking for what are already incurred costs up until the end of November, wherein we would estimate the last month. So in essence, the state will have the documentation that they feel is necessary to release those dollars to you, and there should not be any clawback, with the exception of maybe the last month of the year if there's still money outstanding that we're estimating expenditures on. And Commissioner Collins, you asked about trails, etc. They did clarify in the guidance that capital improvement projects are not eligible unless they're directly related to COVID response. And I guess if county has a project that they think was related directly to COVID response, I just want to have a conversation with them before we submit it for it.
Okay, thanks.
We have Plumage, it looks like you have your hand up. I think again, I want to make sure, so I'm going to open your mic.
Yes, Eric,
Yes.
I thought that I had seen that there may be another bill for counties, local government from DC. Do you know if there's any more funding that they're looking at for counties?
Commissioner, I know that there was a big legislative push to try and get an additional package that was directed specifically at revenue replacement for states and local governments. I think the update that I can give you is that all of that has been put on hold. I was just getting an update this morning. I don't think the Senate is expecting to pass anything at all until the end of this month. And all the negotiations led to a general perception among the Republicans in the Senate that they wanted to see how CARES Act distributions looked like and how that money was being spent before they were going to authorize any additional bills. I do think there's a chance that something will happen, but it's not going to happen until later in June, July at the earliest.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any more hands raised, but I'm going to give just a moment. If you have any questions, go ahead and either raise your hand or type in the chat box. We want to make sure we give everybody a chance.
I do want to say, while we're waiting for those last couple of folks, it's really important for that survey information to get back to us as soon as possible. We'll get those estimated costs to the budget office that look like essentially a quarter of the payments that you might be eligible for, or maybe a third of the payments that you might be eligible for if this thing goes through to December. So the survey is really, really important to try and get us a rough idea of what those incurred costs were for your personnel.
We have a follow-up from Commissioner Plumage. You're open again.
Yes. Eric, with tribes and with larger counties, they have the ability to have planners on their staff. Our smaller counties, like Blaine, we don't have a planner, and I'm just wondering if that would be some item that would be reimbursable. We have the need, we have needs here, but do you think it would be necessary for counties to hire a grant writer or a planner to help us?
Commissioner, that's a great question. The first place I direct you to would be your economic development agency to see if there's a relationship you can hire them on a contract basis that would be reimbursable, help you allocate those costs and track those costs. And if they're not able to do that, or you want to find outside source, I do think that is a eligible expense. Before you execute that, I'd like to talk with the governor's office to get some assurance that if you did that it would be considered reimbursable by the state.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question, hand raised from Jim. Jim, you're open.
Hi, all. I'm not even sure if this is an appropriate question for our meeting, but it's been asked of me of late about assistance to those communities that are relatively close to either the two national parks, meaning Glacier or Yellowstone. So communities like Cook City and Gardner and Livingston and Annis and West Yellowstone. If there's any discussion about assisting those communities as they begin to reopen? Does my question make sense?
It does. And the governor announced on Wednesday that he was going to put some of the CARES Act funding directly to offset the impact of decreased tourism in those amenity destination communities. I didn't look at the details, but I bet Chantel did.
So I read the release yesterday. He announced it, and if you go to Commerce's website where all the other grant programs have been made available for application, you can go there and there's one available for the businesses in those communities. And I believe the grants are for up to $5,000, and there's some other eligibility requirements. And I think that it opens June 1st for that one.
Okay. So you two in particular, you three in particular, Jason, Eric, and you, Chantel, might guess from where I'm getting this pressure in order to assist on a given road.
I've been on that road, Commissioner.
I'm not sure that's enough money to ever help with that road.
All right, thank you.
I will remind you, since you brought it up, Commissioner, the Treasury guidance also recommends that the distribution to local government should be proportional based on your population, not on your taxable value.
Okay, thanks.
We have a question in the chat box. Would it be advisable for counties to create a dedicated fund to deposit the monies into, then interfund transfer?
Yes, except for if we're going to look at it like a reimbursement account and you have a public safety fund, you made a request for expenses in a public safety fund, that transfer could come back into the public safety fund and still pass audit muster. If you wanted to consolidate it to be able to track it and report it back in subsequent audit years, creating a separate restricted revenue account in some ways could make sense.
Angeline, your mic is unmuted.
Hi, this is Angela in Carbon County. So it sounds like our kind of operational expenses are presumed to be reimbursable. So I'm just strategizing for some of the other grants that are out there, like the Board of Crime Control grant, which is very kind of law enforcement specific. Should we be focusing on more of those community needs for those grants? I'm just looking for some guidance, trying to keep track of all these different pots.
Great question, Angela. So let's think about, just in theory, you're going to get compensated. Hypothetically, you're going to get compensated entirely for your law enforcement costs from March 12th to the end of your fiscal year. That money will come back into your county. I anticipate that in your case, it would come back into your general fund, which would be sort of a boon to your general fund, and it allows you options. You could calculate your maximum levy for next year and decrease it by amount because you have extra cash to help with cash carryover. If you have a separate public safety levy, you could talk about not levying the max there to give some offset to your property taxpayers. You could put that money into capital to be able to normalize costs over a long period of time. But ultimately, as you say, what it does is provide additional flexibility for you to target investments in other areas once that money hits your general fund. I would still encourage you to apply for those grants. I don't want counties to look at the CARES Act reimbursements as a windfall. And it doesn't necessarily have to go back for the targeted services that were paid for and that were reimbursed through the CARES Act funding. I think it should create the flexibility that you need and still keep your eye out to those other funding sources that don't look like supplanting.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Angela, the Treasury is defining the payments to local governments not as a grant, but as other financial assistance under CFR 200.40. So that, you're not getting tagged with a grant that's for reimbursement to a specific use. So you should have some additional flexibility there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes it easier. Thank you very much.
All right, do we have any other questions? Oh, I just heard it. I heard a chime. Let me find it. Looks like, oh, is that a follow-up? Nope, I think we're good. All right, any other questions that you'd like to ask either over the mic or in the chat box? Oh. Let's see. Where is it?
Eric, And company, do you guys have any final thoughts or comments you'd like to leave the group with before questions?
Keep gathering your documentation.
And I do think it would be helpful for us to schedule another one of these because things have changed dramatically in the last 24 hours. Once we get we're going to meet with the budget office next Wednesday, and we'll get more clarity about if this changes their process timeframe. So if the folks are interested 2 weeks out, I think it makes sense to try and reschedule.
Okay, so we'll do another one of these in 2 weeks.
I suggest it.
Okay. And any other final questions or thoughts before we sign off as a group? Or any questions in general that you just want to ask, or here's a chance. You got something there, Ashley?
It looks like Jerry Collins might have a question.
Eric, I got it. You know our situation in Garfield County. Is there anybody that the budget's coming up in the clerk and recorder's office? Is there anybody that we can contact to get some help, because this thing is such, I don't know, I guess confusing to start with, and then we have doing our clerk. So is there any place I can go to that I can get some help with this? I mean, besides you guys or local government, is there anybody that is clerk and recorders able to help?
I'm going to defer to Chantel on the clerk and recorder side. The Local Government Services Bureau, Jerry, as you know, they have some technical assistance, but those cutbacks have made it so they're not as, I think, responsive as maybe they could be. I still would point you in their direction, but we've done requests for the Clerk and Recorders Association for some sort of peer-to-peer mentoring, and I'll let Chantel talk.
I mean, whenever the clerk and recorders need any budget help, if that's what you're referring to, I just nag the Local Government Services Bureau. Yes, until I get an answer.
Yeah, budget help. Besides, all this stuff is coming into the clerk and recorder's office to be paid out as payroll claims or whatever. And so, yes, I'm still worried about the double dipping with our new personnel in that office. I need all the help I can find for it, and I'm not sure where to ask.
Jerry, another option, you can tap your auditor under contract to help you without, and there's a line that they'll draw for you, but they can help you and provide technical support about looking at compliance without fouling them of their ability to do your audit at the end. So I'd point you in that direction too. Okay. And that would be a reimbursable expense.
You can also have your clerk and recorder send an email out to the whole clerk group. There's a specific email address that they all use to chat with all the time, and to utilize that network, because they're throwing out any question that pops into their minds, and it really is a great resource for all the clerks.
Okay, thanks.
Jerry, I'm happy to look over anything where you're worried about whether you're double dipping, just to see if I can give you some consult on that.
Okay.
See, he volunteered.
And Dolores, if your regional or local economic development group is not interested or in helping you out, again, I can be a resource for you.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks.
All right, I'm not seeing any other hands or any chat box activity, so I think we have covered all of the questions.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, everybody. And we'll set this up again for 2 weeks from today, probably the same time, 11 o'clock. We'll get the online platform room reserved like we have today, and watch for an email coming out from Chantel inviting you to participate. Appreciate your hard work. Please stay safe. And I guess we'll talk with you in a couple weeks.
Happy Friday, everyone.